I'm going to tell you a story that might sound familiar. Maybe you've lived it. Maybe you've watched someone else live it. Or maybe you're living it right now, wondering if you're crazy for feeling forgotten by the people who are supposed to love you most. My name is Daniel, and last Christmas, I learned the hard way that blood doesn't always make family. But sometimes it takes losing everything to find out who you really are. It was my first Christmas without Margaret. She'd been gone since April, 76 years old, fought cancer for 3 years, with the kind of stubborn grace that made everyone in Macon, Georgia know her name. We'd been married 52 years. High school sweethearts who never really learned how to be apart. You know that feeling when you walk into your house and it echoes differently? When the silence has weight to it? That's what every day felt like after Margaret passed. The coffee maker seemed too loud. The television felt intrusive. Even my own footsteps sounded wrong on the hardwood floors we'd refinished together in 1987. But I had a plan for Christmas. I wasn't going to sit in that empty house feeling sorry for myself. I was going to do what Margaret would have wanted. Bring the family together. Make it feel like home again, even if she wasn't there to make her famous cornbread dressing or fuss over whether the turkey was too dry. So I called my son Christopher. He's 38 now, married to a woman named Samantha for 8 years. They live about 40 minutes away in a subdivision with names like Whispering Oaks and Heritage Point. You know the type. Big houses, small yards, HOA fees that cost more than my first car payment. Dad, Christopher said when I called him in early December. His voice had that distracted quality it always got when he was probably checking email while talking to me. How are you holding up? I'm doing all right, son. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about Christmas. There was a pause. In the background, I could hear Samantha talking to someone, probably on another phone. Everything in their house always seemed to be happening in layers, multiple conversations, multiple screens, multiple priorities. Yeah, about that, Dad. Sam and I were actually talking about Christmas plans. Perfect, I said, settling into Margaret's chair without thinking about it. Because I want to host this year. Nothing fancy, just us 3. I thought I'd make some of the old favorites, like Mom used to. Another pause, longer this time. That sounds really nice, Dad, but we've got some scheduling complications. Sam's mom is expecting us at their place, and you know how her family gets about traditions. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I pushed forward anyway. Well, what about Christmas Eve then? Or even the day after Christmas? I'm flexible. Let me talk to Sam and get back to you, okay? That conversation was 3 weeks before Christmas. He never got back to me. I called him twice. Once the following week. Once the week after that. Both times I got voicemail. Both times he texted back hours later with some version of, "Crazy busy, we'll call you back soon." But I kept planning anyway. Maybe that makes me stubborn. Maybe it makes me stupid. Or maybe it just makes me a father who wasn't ready to spend his first Christmas alone. I threw myself into preparing for Christmas dinner like it was a military operation. Margaret always said I was at my best when I had a project, something to organize and execute. She wasn't wrong. I started with a list. Not just any list. A detailed, categorized, color-coded list that would have made Margaret laugh and shake her head at the same time. She always said I approached cooking like an engineer, which I suppose made sense since I'd been a civil engineer for 34 years before retiring. Main course. Prime rib roast. Margaret's recipe with rosemary and garlic. Sides. Mashed potatoes with cream cheese, green bean casserole with the crispy onions on top, cornbread dressing, from Margaret's handwritten recipe card that was so stained and worn I could barely read it, cranberry sauce from scratch. Desserts. Pecan pie, sweet potato pie, and Margaret's chocolate chess pie that Christopher always said was better than any restaurant. I spent hours at the Piggly Wiggly, carefully selecting everything. The butcher, a young man named Dave who'd helped Margaret and me for years, asked where Mrs. Daniel was. "She passed this spring," I told him. "Oh man, Mr. Daniel, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. She always knew exactly how she wanted everything cut. That's all right, son. I'm trying to carry on the tradition. He helped me pick out the best roast they had, gave me detailed instructions on timing and temperature, even wrote it down on a piece of butcher paper. Your family's gonna love this, he said as he wrapped it up. I hope so, I replied, and I meant it. I spent 3 days preparing. Not just cooking, but preparing. I deep cleaned the dining room, polished the silver serving pieces that hadn't been used since last Thanksgiving, ironed the good tablecloth, the one with tiny embroidered holly leaves that Margaret's mother had given us as a wedding gift. I set up the Christmas tree on December 20th. It had been sitting in the garage for a week, soaking in water, filling the whole space with that sharp, clean pine smell. Margaret always insisted on a real tree, even when I argued that the artificial ones looked just as good and didn't drop needles. Daniel, she'd say, if you want artificial, you can have artificial flowers at my funeral. Until then, we get a real tree. I'd bought one anyway, partly out of habit, partly because I could almost hear her voice telling me to stop being cheap and get the good one. Setting it up alone was harder than I expected. Not physically. I'm still in good shape for 74, still do my morning walks, still maintain the yard myself. But every ornament had a story. Every step of the process was something Margaret and I had done together for over 5 decades. The star on top was especially difficult. Margaret was always the one who climbed the stepladder to place it. She was 8 inches shorter than me, but she claimed the height advantage gave her the right perspective. You're too tall, Daniel, she'd say. You can't see what it looks like from down here. I climbed up there myself, wobbling slightly on the ladder, and tried to center the star the way she would have. When I climbed down and looked at it, it was crooked. I went up twice more to adjust it. It was still crooked, but eventually I gave up. Margaret would have fixed it in one try. The house looked beautiful, though. I'm not just saying that. Even I could see it. The tree lights reflected in the windows, the candles on the mantel, the dining room table set with our wedding china that we'd only used for special occasions. The whole place felt warm and alive in a way it hadn't since Margaret died. On December 23rd, I called Christopher one more time. Hey, Dad, he answered on the second ring. I could hear Christmas music in the background, voices, the sound of a party or gathering. Just wanted to confirm tomorrow, I said. Dinner's at 3 o'clock. Should I plan on you and Samantha? Tomorrow? He sounded genuinely confused. Christmas, son. Christmas dinner. We talked about this. There was muffled conversation on his end, like he was covering the phone with his hand. When he came back, his voice was different. Careful. Dad? I thought we talked about this. We're going to Samantha's parents' house. We've been planning it for weeks. My chest felt tight. When did we talk about that? When did you tell me you weren't coming? Dad, I thought I mentioned it. I'm sorry if there was confusion. Confusion? Like I was an old man who couldn't keep track of simple conversations. Christopher, I've been planning this for weeks. I've bought enough food for... I know, and I feel bad about the miscommunication. Maybe we can do something next weekend? After New Year's? The party sounds in the background got louder. Someone laughed. A woman, not Samantha, called out something about charades. Where are you right now? I asked. Just a little Christmas party at the Hendersons. You remember them? Sam's friends from college? We'll probably head home soon and then get up early to drive to Savannah. The Hendersons. I didn't remember them, but I remembered that Samantha's parents lived in Savannah, 2.5 hours away, which meant this wasn't a last-minute decision. This was planned. Son, I said quietly, I need you to be straight with me. Did you ever plan to come to Christmas dinner tomorrow? The silence stretched long enough that I knew the answer before he said anything. Dad, look, it's complicated. Sam's family has these traditions and her mom really wanted us there and... Christopher. What? Did you ever plan to come? He sighed. No. Probably not. But I didn't know how to tell you without hurting your feelings. There it was. The truth. He'd let me plan and shop and cook and clean and hope for 3 weeks, knowing the entire time that he wasn't going to show up, because he didn't want to hurt my feelings. "I have to go, Dad. We'll talk soon, okay?" The line went dead before I could respond. I woke up at 5:30 on Christmas morning, the way I had for the last 40 years. Margaret used to tease me about it. "Daniel, it's a holiday, not a work day." But I'd always been an early riser. It felt wrong to change that just because she wasn't there to witness it. The house was cold. I'd turned the heat down before bed out of habit, but now the silence felt different, heavier, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every sound, the refrigerator humming, the old house settling, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking out at the backyard. Margaret's flower beds were dormant now, just dark soil and the stubble of last summer's growth. She'd spent hours out there in the spring and summer, dirt under her fingernails, sun hat tilted to keep the glare off her face. I'd always meant to help more, but engineering jobs have their own seasons and demands. The prime rib was already seasoned and ready to go in the oven. I'd followed Margaret's timing notes exactly, start the roast at 10 a.m. for a 3 p.m. dinner. The side dishes were prepped and waiting in the refrigerator. Everything was ready. Everything except the people who were supposed to eat it. I sat there for a long time, holding my coffee mug, watching the sun come up through the bare oak trees. Margaret and I used to love Christmas mornings. Not just because of the presents, though we always got each other something small and thoughtful, but because of the feeling, the anticipation, the sense that the day held something special. But this morning felt hollow. I kept thinking about Christopher's voice on the phone, that careful tone he used when he was managing me, like I was a problem to be solved instead of his father. At 9 a.m. I made a decision. I was going to cook the dinner anyway, not because I thought Christopher might change his mind and show up, not because I was in denial about spending Christmas alone, but because Margaret would have wanted me to. Because the act of cooking, of following her recipes, of making the house smell like Christmas, that was its own kind of companionship. I put on some music, not Christmas carols, but the old country records Margaret and I used to dance to in the kitchen while she cooked. George Jones, Patsy Cline, Hank Williams Sr. The kind of music that reminded me of who we were before we became parents, before we became older, before cancer and silence and empty houses. The prime rib went in the oven right on schedule. I started on the dressing, mixing cornbread and biscuits and celery and onions, adding chicken stock a little at a time the way Margaret's recipe card instructed. Her handwriting was faded but still legible. "Don't make it too wet. Daniel always likes it on the dry side." She was right. I did like it on the dry side. By 1 p.m. the house smelled incredible, the kind of rich, layered smells that make your mouth water and your heart ache at the same time. I had set the dining room table for 3 out of habit more than hope. My place at the head, Margaret's chair to my right, even though she wasn't coming, and Christopher's chair to my left, even though he wasn't either. At 2:30 I started checking my phone, not because I expected anything, but because hope is a stubborn thing. It doesn't listen to logic or evidence or even direct statements. It just keeps hoping. At 2:45, I put the final touches on everything. The roast was perfect, pink in the center, crispy on the outside. The mashed potatoes were fluffy and rich. The green bean casserole was golden brown on top. Everything was exactly the way Margaret would have made it, except maybe a little better because I'd had all day to get it right. At 3 p.m. sharp, I sat down at the dining room table by myself. I looked at Margaret's empty chair and Christopher's empty chair, and for the first time since Margaret died, I felt angry. Not sad, not lonely. Angry. I was angry at Christopher for lying to me. I was angry at Samantha for never liking me, never making an effort, never understanding that I wasn't trying to steal her husband. I was trying to keep my son. I was angry at myself for believing that blood and history and 50 years of Christmas dinners meant something more than convenience. But mostly, I was angry at Margaret for leaving me to figure this out alone. I know that's not fair. Cancer isn't a choice. Death isn't a betrayal. But sitting at that table, looking at all that food I'd prepared for people who didn't want to be there, I felt abandoned in a way that went deeper than grief. I tried to eat. I put small portions of everything on my plate, but my throat felt closed up. Everything tasted like sawdust and effort. After 10 minutes, I gave up and just sat there, listening to the grandfather clock in the living room mark the passing time. At 3:30, the doorbell rang. For one crazy moment, my heart jumped. Maybe Christopher had changed his mind. Maybe he was standing on my porch with Samantha and an apology, ready to salvage Christmas dinner and pretend this whole mess was just a misunderstanding. I smoothed my shirt. I'd put on my good Christmas sweater, the red one Margaret bought me 3 years ago, and hurried to the front door. It wasn't Christopher. It was a young woman in a FedEx uniform, holding a manila envelope and looking apologetic. "Mr. Daniel Clark?" she asked. "Yes." "Delivery for you, sir. Merry Christmas." She handed me the envelope and walked back to her truck without waiting for a signature. I stood on the porch, cold air seeping through my sweater, staring at the package in my hands. The return address was a law office I didn't recognize, Pemberton Hayes Associates. Inside was a card, not a Christmas card, but a simple folded note card with Christopher's name printed at the top. "Dad, Samantha and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if we spend the holidays with her family from now on. It's nothing personal, but her parents are getting older too, and we feel like we need to prioritize that relationship right now. We hope you understand, and that you have a nice, quiet Christmas. We'll call you next week to check in. Love. Christopher, Samantha." I read it twice, then I read it again. Then I folded it carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. They hadn't forgotten. They hadn't gotten busy. They hadn't miscommunicated. They had planned this. They had decided together to exclude me from Christmas. And instead of having the conversation like adults, instead of giving me a chance to understand or adjust or make other plans, they had mailed me a note like I was a creditor they were dismissing. I walked back inside and closed the door. The house still smelled like Christmas dinner. The table was still set for 3. The grandfather clock was still marking time. But something had changed. Some fundamental assumption I'd carried about my place in the world, about the relationship between effort and reward, between love and family, had cracked clean through. I sat back down at the dining room table and stared at Margaret's empty chair. "Well," I said out loud, "I guess it's just us." But even Margaret wasn't really there. And for the first time since she died, I felt the full weight of being truly alone. I couldn't sleep that night. I tried for a few hours, lying in the bed Margaret and I had shared for over 3 decades, listening to the house settle and the wind rattle the windows. But every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that note, the careful, corporate language of it. "We hope you understand. Nothing personal. How do you exclude your widowed father from Christmas and call it nothing personal?" At 2 a.m. I gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen to make tea. Margaret always said chamomile helped with restless nights, though I'd never been much of a tea drinker. As the water boiled, I found myself staring out the window at the backyard, at the bare trees and dormant flower beds. That's when I remembered the bird feeder. Margaret had been obsessed with that thing. She'd hung it from the old maple tree the first spring we moved into this house 47 years ago. Every Saturday morning she'd take a coffee can full of birdseed and refill it, then stand at the kitchen window watching for cardinals and blue jays and the occasional woodpecker. But I hadn't filled it since she died. It had been hanging there empty for 8 months, a monument to all the small routines that die when someone you love is gone. The guilt hit me like a physical weight. Margaret would have hated knowing I'd let her birds go hungry. She used to say they depended on us, especially in winter, and that we had a responsibility to the creatures who trusted us enough to make our yard their home. I put on my coat and boots and walked out into the cold. The grass was brittle with frost and my breath made little clouds in the air. The bird feeder hung about 6 feet off the ground, swaying slightly in the winter wind. As I reached up to unhook it from the branch, something crinkled under my fingers. There was a plastic bag taped to the back of the feeder, hidden behind the wooden roof where I wouldn't have noticed it unless I was looking from exactly this angle. Inside the bag was an envelope with my name on it, written in Margaret's careful cursive. I stood there in my backyard at 2:30 in the morning, holding an envelope from my dead wife, feeling like the world had just shifted sideways. Back inside, I sat at the kitchen table and opened it with shaking hands. The letter was dated 3 months before Margaret died, back when she was still having good days mixed in with the bad ones. My dearest Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I've been gone long enough for you to finally check on that bird feeder. I knew it would take you a while. You always said taking care of the birds was my job, not yours. But I also knew that eventually, your sense of duty would win out. It always does. I need to tell you some things I couldn't say while I was alive. Not because I was afraid, but because you would have tried to fix them, and some things can't be fixed. They can only be understood. Check the safety deposit box at First National, box 247. The key is in my jewelry box, taped to the bottom of the velvet tray. There are papers there you need to see. And Daniel, I love you. I loved you every day of our marriage, even when you left your coffee cups all over the house and forgot to put the toilet seat down and tried to organize my flower beds like they were engineering projects. Especially then. Take care of yourself, and for God's sake, feed the birds. All my love. Margaret. I sat there for a long time, reading the letter over and over. Margaret's voice was so clear in every line, I could almost hear her saying the words. The gentle teasing, the practical instructions, the way she always seemed to know me better than I knew myself. The safety deposit box. We'd had it for years, mainly to store our important documents, birth certificates, the deed to the house, our wills. But Margaret had always been the one to manage it. I'd signed the papers, but she was the one who actually visited the bank, who knew what was in there, who kept track of when the annual fee was due. I looked at the kitchen clock, 3:17 a.m. The bank wouldn't open for another 6 hours. I spent the rest of the night sitting in Margaret's chair, holding her letter, wondering what she had left for me to find. Part of me was afraid to know. The other part of me, the larger part, was grateful that she was still taking care of me, still guiding me through the difficult parts, even after death. At 9 a.m. sharp, I was standing outside First National Bank when they unlocked the doors. The safety deposit box was in the basement vault, down a narrow stairway that always made me feel claustrophobic. The bank employee, a young woman named Jessica, who'd helped us before, led me to box 247 and used her key along with mine to open it. "Take your time, Mr. Clark," she said. "Just let me know when you're finished." Inside the box were the documents I expected, our wills, insurance policies, the deed to the house, but also a manila folder I'd never seen before. Written on the tab, in Margaret's handwriting, was, "For Daniel, the truth about Christopher." My hands were trembling as I opened it. The first document was a bank statement from an account I didn't know we had. Margaret Clark, account holder. Opened in 2018. Current balance, $127,000. I stared at the number, trying to make sense of it. Where had this money come from? Why had Margaret opened an account without telling me? We'd always shared everything, or at least I thought we had. The next document was a photocopy of a canceled check. Made out to Christopher, for $15,000, signed by me. Except I'd never written that check. My signature was close, very close, but not exact. The D in Daniel was too round. The K in Clark had an extra loop, small differences, the kind you might not notice unless you were looking for them. But I was looking for them now, and I could see the forgery clear as day. There were more photocopies, more checks, all made out to Christopher or to cash, all with my forged signature. Over the course of 3 years, someone had stolen nearly $40,000 from our joint checking account. The folder also contained printed emails between Margaret and the bank's fraud department. She'd noticed the discrepancies, investigated them, and discovered what was happening. But instead of confronting Christopher directly, she'd quietly moved our savings into a separate account to protect what was left. The last document in the folder was a letter addressed to me, dated just 2 weeks before Margaret died. Daniel. I know this will be hard to understand, but Christopher has been stealing from us for years. I have proof, copies of the forged checks, correspondence with the bank, even a security camera video from the ATM where he deposited one of them. I never told you because I knew it would break your heart. You love that boy more than anything in this world, and I couldn't bear to watch you lose your faith in him while you were also losing me. But you need to know the truth. Not so you can punish him, but so you can protect yourself. I'm worried about what might happen after I'm gone. I'm worried he might try to take advantage of your grief, your loneliness, your need to hold on to family. The account with $127,000 is in my name only. After I die, it will pass to you according to my will. Christopher doesn't know about it. Use it wisely. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this in person. I'm sorry for all of it. Love. Margaret. I sat in that tiny vault room surrounded by the evidence of my son's betrayal and felt something inside me break. Not break apart, but break open. Like a dam giving way to a flood. Christopher hadn't just abandoned me on Christmas. He'd been stealing from me for years. While Margaret was dying, while I was focused on doctors and treatments and trying to make her comfortable, he was forging my signature and taking money that was supposed to secure our retirement, our final years together. And Margaret knew. She'd known all along, and she'd protected me from the truth because she understood it would destroy me. I gathered up all the documents, locked the safety deposit box, and walked out of the bank in a daze. The December air felt sharp and clean after the stuffiness of the vault. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd learned. My son was a thief. My wife had been protecting me from that knowledge until her dying day, and I had been so focused on holding the family together that I hadn't noticed either of those things. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since Margaret's funeral. I called my brother James. James lives in Atlanta, about 2 hours away. We'd grown apart over the years, not through any particular conflict, just the natural drift that happens when people build separate lives. But he'd always been straight with me, even when I didn't want to hear it. Danny? He sounded surprised to hear from me. We'd exchanged Christmas cards but hadn't actually talked since summer. Hey James, I need some advice. Sure, brother, what's going on? I told him everything. The Christmas dinner, Christopher's note, the documents in Margaret's safety deposit box. James listened without interrupting, the way he used to when we were kids and I was explaining some complicated problem I'd gotten myself into. When I finished, there was a long silence. Danny, he said finally, I'm sorry. About all of it. Did you know? About Christopher, I mean? Another pause. I suspected something wasn't right. Last time I saw him at Margaret's funeral, he was asking a lot of questions about your finances. Wanted to know about insurance payouts, retirement accounts, whether you'd need help managing everything. It felt opportunistic. Why didn't you say anything? Because you were grieving. Because I didn't have proof. Because I hoped I was wrong. He sighed. And because you wouldn't have believed me. You've always had a blind spot when it comes to Christopher. He was right. I would have defended Christopher, made excuses, found ways to rationalize whatever behavior James was concerned about. Because that's what fathers do. We protect our children's reputations, even from ourselves. What do I do now? I asked. That depends. Do you want justice or do you want peace? It was a good question. A fair question. And I didn't have an answer. I spent the next 3 days thinking about James's question. Justice or peace? Part of me wanted to call the police, show them the evidence, press charges for forgery and theft. Christopher had stolen from his dying mother and grieving father. He deserved consequences. But another part of me just felt tired. Tired of fighting, tired of hoping, tired of trying to maintain relationships that only worked when I was the one doing all the work. On December 28th, I made my decision. I called Christopher. "Hey, Dad," he answered on the third ring. His voice was casual, cheerful even. "How was your Christmas?" The question hit me like a slap. How was my Christmas? The Christmas I'd spent alone because he'd abandoned me? The Christmas I'd learned my son was a thief? "Quiet," I said. "We need to talk." "Sure, what's on your mind?" "Not over the phone. I want you to come to the house." "When?" "Now." There was a pause. "Dad, is everything okay? You sound upset." "Just come over, Christopher. We'll talk when you get here." He arrived 45 minutes later. I was waiting in the living room, the folder from Margaret's safety deposit box on the coffee table in front of me. Christopher came in through the front door without knocking, the way he'd been doing since he was a teenager. "Hey, Dad," he said, but his smile faltered when he saw my expression. "What's going on?" "Sit down." He sat in the chair across from me, the same chair he'd occupied every Christmas morning for 20 years. But this conversation wasn't about memories or traditions. I opened the folder and pulled out the first photocopied check. "Do you recognize this?" I asked. Christopher looked at it, and I watched his face change. The casual confidence drained away, replaced by something that looked like panic. What is this?" "It's a check for $15,000, made out to you with my forged signature on it." He stared at the paper, saying nothing. I pulled out the next check and the next, laying them out on the coffee table like evidence in a courtroom. "This one's for $8,000. This one's for $12,000. This one's for $10,000. Christopher's face had gone pale. "Dad, I can explain." "Can you?" "Because I've been trying to understand how my son could steal from me while his mother was dying of cancer, and I'm coming up empty." "It wasn't like that," he said quickly. "I was going to pay it back. I just needed some time to get my business off the ground and—" "Your business?" "The contracting thing I told you about. Remember? I was going to flip houses, but I needed startup capital and the bank wouldn't give me a loan without collateral. So you decided to forge my signature instead of asking me for help?" Christopher looked down. "I knew you wouldn't approve." "You're damn right I wouldn't approve, but that's not why you didn't ask, is it?" He glanced up at me confused. "You didn't ask because you knew I'd say no. And you knew I'd say no because this wasn't about starting a business. This was about gambling debts." His face went white. "How did you—" "Your mother wasn't stupid, Christopher. She investigated. She knew about the poker games, the sports betting, the casino trips to Atlanta. She knew exactly where that money was going." For a moment, Christopher looked like the scared little boy who used to run to me when he'd broken something in the house. But that boy had grown up to become a man who would steal from his dying mother. "I'm sick, Dad," he said quietly. "It's an addiction. I've been trying to get help, but when? When what? When have you been trying to get help? When have you gone to a meeting or seen a counselor or even admitted to Samantha what you've been doing?" The silence told me everything I needed to know. "She doesn't know, does she?" I continued. "About the gambling, about the stealing, about any of it?" Christopher shook his head. "So when you sent me that note about spending Christmas with her family, when you talked about prioritizing that relationship, you were really just avoiding me because you were afraid I might find out what you'd been doing." "Dad, please. How long have you been planning to cut me out of your life, son?" The question hung in the air between us. Christopher opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. "Because I've been thinking about this," I continued. "The missed phone calls, the canceled visits, the way you always seem to be in a hurry when you're here. I thought it was about Samantha not liking me, or you being busy with work, or just the natural way families drift apart. But it wasn't any of those things, was it?" "Dad, it was guilt. You couldn't look at me without remembering what you'd taken. You couldn't sit at my dinner table without thinking about the money you'd stolen. You couldn't pretend to be my son while you were robbing me blind." Christopher started to cry. Not the dramatic sobbing of a child, but the quiet, defeated tears of a man who'd been caught doing something unforgivable. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For which part? For stealing the money, or for getting caught?" "For all of it." I sat back in my chair and looked at him. This was my son. The boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager I'd helped with homework, the young man I'd walked down the aisle at his wedding. The person I'd loved more than anyone except Margaret, and he'd betrayed me in ways I was still discovering. "Your mother protected you," I said finally, "right up until the end. She could have told me what you were doing, could have let me press charges, could have cut you out of the will entirely. But she didn't. Do you know why?" Christopher shook his head. "Because she thought you might change. She thought if she gave you time, if she didn't force a confrontation while she was dying, you might find a way to make it right." "I wanted to," he said. "I really did want to pay it back. But you didn't. And instead of facing up to what you'd done, you decided it would be easier to just disappear from my life. Gradually. Politely. With excuses about Samantha's family and busy schedules." Christopher wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "What happens now?" I looked at the checks spread across the coffee table, then back at my son. "That depends on you." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you have a choice to make. You can keep pretending this never happened, keep avoiding me, keep building your life around the lie that you're a good man who just made some mistakes. Or you can face the truth about what you've become and decide if that's who you want to be." "I don't understand." "Gambling addiction is a disease, Christopher. I know that. But theft is a choice. Lying to your wife is a choice. Abandoning your father on Christmas is a choice. And every day you don't get help, every day you don't make amends, every day you don't change, those are choices too." He sat there, staring at his hands. "I want you to leave now," I said. "Take some time to think about what kind of man you want to be. And when you figured that out, if you ever figure that out, you know where to find me." Christopher stood slowly. "Dad, don't make promises you won't keep. Don't apologize again unless you mean it. Just go." He walked to the front door, then turned back. "Do you hate me?" I thought about that question for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "I don't hate you, but I don't trust you either, and I don't think I like who you've become." After he left, I gathered up all the documents and put them back in the folder. The house felt different somehow. Not emptier. It had been empty since Margaret died. But cleaner. Like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. That night I couldn't sleep again. But this time it wasn't grief or confusion keeping me awake. It was clarity. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I made a list. Not a grocery list or a to-do list, but a life list. The things I wanted to do with whatever time I had left. The things I'd been putting off while I waited for my family to remember they loved me. Travel to Ireland. Margaret and I had always talked about going, but we'd never made the trip. Always too expensive, always some other priority, always next year. Learn to paint. I'd been good at technical drawing in my engineering career, but I'd never tried anything artistic. Margaret always said I had an eye for composition. Volunteer somewhere meaningful. Maybe Habitat for Humanity. Maybe the literacy program at the library. Maybe something I hadn't thought of yet. Make new friends. Real friends, not just people I nodded to at the grocery store or talked to about the weather. Stop waiting for people to choose me. That last one wasn't an activity exactly, but it felt like the most important item on the list. I'd spent 8 months since Margaret's death trying to hold on to Christopher, trying to maintain a relationship that only existed when I was the one reaching out, planning, hoping, forgiving. I'd been so afraid of losing my son that I'd let him abuse me financially and emotionally, but I wasn't afraid anymore. Losing someone who treats you badly isn't actually a loss. It's a liberation. The next morning I called the travel agency downtown. The woman who answered, Linda, was incredibly helpful. She'd been to Ireland 3 times and had all sorts of recommendations for a solo traveler. We spent an hour on the phone planning a 2-week trip for March, after the worst of winter was over, but before the tourist season really kicked in. "You're going to love it, Mr. Clark," she said. "There's something magical about Ireland, especially for someone traveling alone. It's the perfect place to rediscover yourself." That afternoon, I drove to the community college and signed up for a watercolor painting class that started in January. The instructor, a woman named Patricia with paint-stained fingers and an infectious smile, showed me around the art studio and explained what supplies I'd need. "Have you painted before?" she asked. "No, but I've always wanted to try." "That's the best attitude," she said. "No preconceptions, no bad habits to break. Just pure possibility." Pure possibility. I liked the sound of that. That evening, I called James back. "How are you doing, Danny?" he asked. "Have you talked to Christopher?" "I did. It went about as well as you'd expect." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I think it needed to happen. I think I needed to stop pretending everything was fine when it wasn't." "So what's next?" I told him about Ireland, about the painting class, about my decision to stop organizing my life around people who didn't want to be in it. "You sound different," James said. "How so?" "Lighter. Like you've been holding your breath for months and finally let it out." He wasn't wrong. I felt like I'd been underwater and had just broken the surface. "James," I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest." "Shoot." "Do you think I'm a good father?" There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean, did I raise Christopher wrong? Did I spoil him or fail to teach him right from wrong, or somehow create the person he became?" "Danny, listen to me. You are one of the most decent men I know. You worked hard. You provided for your family. You were faithful to Margaret for over 50 years. You taught Christopher right from wrong. The fact that he chose wrong isn't a reflection on your parenting. Then why? Some people are broken in ways that have nothing to do with how they were raised. Some people make bad choices because that's who they choose to be. You can't love someone into being better than they want to be." I felt something release in my chest. A knot of guilt and self-blame I'd been carrying without even realizing it. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" "For reminding me that I'm not responsible for other people's choices. Only my own." After we hung up, I walked through the house, really looking at it for the first time in months. It was a good house. Margaret and I had made it a home over nearly 5 decades. But it was also full of ghosts, memories of Christmases that were different, family dinners that felt warmer, a version of life that no longer existed. Maybe it was time to make some new memories. Different ones, but not necessarily worse ones. The painting class started on a cold Tuesday in January. I arrived early, nervous in a way I hadn't been since my first day at the engineering firm 40 years ago. The studio was bright and airy, with big windows facing north and easels arranged in a rough circle. My classmates were an eclectic group. There was Patricia, the instructor, who looked like she'd stepped out of a bohemian novel. A retired librarian named Dorothy, who wore colorful scarves and had opinions about everything. A young mother named Jessica who painted during her lunch breaks. A quiet man about my age named Frank who'd started painting after his wife died. "I needed something to do with my hands," Frank explained during our first break. "Something that wasn't about fixing things or maintaining things. Something creative." I understood that completely. We started with basic color theory, learning how to mix paints and understanding the relationships between different hues. It was surprisingly mathematical, which appealed to the engineer in me. But there was also something intuitive about it, something that couldn't be reduced to formulas or rules. My first painting was terrible, a lopsided landscape that looked like it had been created by a kindergartner with vision problems. But I loved it anyway. There was something meditative about the process, something that quieted the constant chatter in my mind. "Don't judge it," Patricia said, looking over my shoulder. "Just enjoy it. You're not painting to create a masterpiece. You're painting to discover something about yourself." "What am I discovering?" She smiled. That's for you to figure out. After class, Frank and I walked out together. He invited me for coffee at the diner across the street. How long has it been? He asked after we'd ordered. Since my wife died? 8 months. He nodded. 3 years for me. I thought I was doing okay, but then I realized I hadn't talked to another human being in 4 days. That's when I knew I needed to get out of the house. Do you have kids? 2 daughters. They live in California and Michigan. They call once a week, visit once a year. Good kids, but they have their own lives. Do you miss them? I miss the idea of them, he said thoughtfully. I miss thinking I was more important to them than I actually am. But I don't miss the disappointment anymore. Over the next few weeks, Frank and I became friends. We met for coffee after every painting class, then started having lunch once a week at different restaurants around town. He introduced me to hiking groups and book clubs. I introduced him to Margaret's bird feeder and the peaceful ritual of morning walks. Frank had something I was learning to value. He was present. When we talked, he listened. When we spent time together, he was actually there, not distracted by his phone or thinking about somewhere else he'd rather be. He was the kind of friend I'd forgotten existed. In February, I got a phone call from Christopher. I almost didn't answer it. Dad, it's me. I know. How are you? I'm fine, Christopher. What do you need? I wanted to tell you that I've started going to meetings, Gamblers Anonymous, and I've been seeing a counselor. That's good. I'm glad to hear it. I also told Samantha about everything, the gambling, the money I took, all of it. I waited. She's pretty upset. We're doing couples counseling now, trying to work through it. I hope that goes well for you. There was a long pause. Dad, I want to make this right. I want to pay you back, and I want to rebuild our relationship. Christopher, I appreciate that you're getting help. I really do, but I need you to understand something. What? I don't need you to make anything right. I don't need your money, and I don't need your relationship. I've built a life that works without either of those things. But you're my father. Yes, I am, and you're my son. But that doesn't mean I have to accept being treated badly just because we share DNA. I'm trying to change. I hope you succeed, for your sake and for Samantha's sake. But I'm not going to wait around to see if you do. After we hung up, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no hope, no disappointment, just a kind of neutral acceptance. Christopher was what he was. He might change, he might not. Either way, it wasn't my responsibility anymore. I left for Ireland on a rainy Thursday in March. Frank drove me to the airport, refusing to let me take a taxi. 2 weeks, he said as we unloaded my suitcase. Are you nervous? Terrified, I admitted. I've never traveled anywhere alone. Margaret always handled the planning, the logistics, all of it. You'll figure it out, and if you don't, you'll ask for help. That's what travel is for, figuring out what you're capable of. The flight to Dublin was long but uneventful. I'd brought books, but I ended up spending most of the time staring out the window, watching the landscape change from Georgia farmland to ocean to the green patchwork of Irish countryside. I'd booked a small bed and breakfast in a village called Dingle on the western coast. The photos online had looked charming in that authentic, slightly worn way that you can't fake. When I arrived, it was even better than I'd hoped. The proprietor, a woman named Maeve with silver hair and a musical accent, showed me to my room and immediately invited me for tea. You're traveling alone? She asked as we sat in her kitchen, which smelled like bread and lavender. I am. Good for you. Too many people think they can't do things without a partner, but some of the best adventures happen when you're on your own. She was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I did things I never would have done with Margaret, not because she would have objected, but because I would have been too worried about whether she was comfortable, whether she was enjoying herself, whether I was making the right choices for both of us. I spent an entire afternoon in a pub in Killarney, talking to locals about sheep farming and political history. I took a boat to the Aran Islands and walked the ancient stone walls in weather that Margaret would have called unsuitable for human beings. I visited Trinity College and spent 3 hours in the library, reading Irish poetry and feeling like I was discovering a part of myself I hadn't known existed. But the most meaningful moment happened on my last day. I was sitting on the cliffs near Dingle, watching the sun set over the Atlantic Ocean. The wind was sharp and cold, but the light was incredible. Layers of gold and orange and pink that changed by the minute. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, then stopped. Instead, I just sat there and watched. I let myself be present in that moment, fully aware of where I was and how I felt, without trying to capture it or share it or preserve it for anyone else. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt complete. Not happy exactly, but whole. Like I was enough, just as I was, sitting alone on an Irish cliff watching the sun go down. When I got back to Georgia, I had stories to tell and pictures to share. But more importantly, I had proof. Proof that I could take care of myself, that I could be alone without being lonely, that I could create meaning and joy without waiting for someone else to provide it. Spring came early that year. By the end of March, the daffodils Margaret had planted were already blooming, and the dogwood tree in the front yard was starting to bud. I found myself spending more time outside, not because I was particularly interested in gardening, but because the house felt different now. Not bad, just smaller somehow, like I'd outgrown it. I'd been thinking about selling it. Not immediately, but eventually. It was too big for one person, too full of memories that belonged to a different version of my life. But before I made any major decisions, I wanted to do something Margaret would have approved of. I wanted to plant a garden, not flowers. Margaret had always handled the decorative stuff. I wanted to grow vegetables, something practical, something I could eat or share or preserve, something that would connect me to the earth in a way I'd never experienced during my decades of working with concrete and steel. I started small, a raised bed in the back corner of the yard, maybe 8 feet by 4 feet. I spent a weekend building the frame and filling it with good soil from the garden center. The young man who helped me load the bags into my truck asked what I was planning to grow. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "Tomatoes, maybe. Peppers. Whatever grows well in Georgia." "First garden?" "First solo garden. My wife used to handle all this." He nodded knowingly. "My grandfather started gardening after my grandmother died. Said it gave him something to nurture that didn't talk back." I liked that. Something to nurture that didn't talk back. I planted tomatoes, bell peppers, cucumbers, and herbs. Nothing fancy. Nothing that required advanced knowledge or special equipment. I also planted a small patch of sunflowers, because Margaret had always loved them and I thought she'd enjoy knowing they were growing in her former flower beds. Gardening, it turned out, was a lot like painting. You start with basic principles: soil preparation, proper spacing, adequate water. But there's also an intuitive element that can't be learned from books. You have to watch and listen, and adjust based on what the plants are telling you. It was also surprisingly social. Frank started coming over on Saturday mornings to help with weeding and watering. Dorothy from the painting class stopped by one afternoon and offered advice about pest control. Even Maeve, from the bed and breakfast in Ireland, sent me an email with her grandmother's recipe for natural fertilizer. "Seaweed and fish emulsion," she wrote. "Sounds disgusting, works beautifully." By June, the garden was thriving. The tomatoes were heavy and red, the peppers were crisp and sweet, and the herbs were so abundant I was giving them away to anyone who would take them. I felt proud in a way I hadn't since my engineering days, the satisfaction of building something from nothing, of seeing a plan through from conception to completion. One evening in July, I was out watering the plants when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I looked up to see Christopher getting out of his sedan, moving slowly like he wasn't sure he was welcome. "Hey, Dad," he called out. "Christopher." I didn't stop watering. He walked over to the garden and looked at the neat rows of vegetables. "This is new. Seemed like a good use of the space." "It looks great. Really professional." I turned off the hose and faced him. "What can I do for you? I wanted to talk if you have a few minutes." I gestured toward the 2 lawn chairs I'd set up near the garden. We sat down, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The cicadas were loud in the oak trees, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking. "I've been sober for 4 months," Christopher said finally. "No gambling, no drinking, no anything." "That's good. It's hard. Harder than I thought it would be, but Samantha is supporting me and the meetings help." I nodded. "I've also been working with a financial counselor, trying to figure out how to pay you back. It's going to take time, but I want to make it right." "Christopher, I told you." "I know what you told me, but this isn't about what you need. It's about what I need. I need to take responsibility for what I did." I studied his face. He looked older than his 38 years, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. But he also looked more present than he had in years, like he was actually inhabiting his own life instead of running from it. "How much?" I asked. $37,462, plus interest, which brings it to just over $41,000. The precision of the number surprised me. "You know exactly?" "I know exactly. I've been tracking every cent I took, every forged signature, every lie I told to cover it up. My counselor says I need to face the full scope of what I did if I want to change." We sat in silence for a while, watching the evening light fade across the garden. "I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago," Christopher said. "I'm not asking you to trust me or forgive me or pretend this didn't happen, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to become someone better." "Why?" I asked. "Why what? Why are you trying to change? Is it because you got caught? Because Samantha threatened to leave? Because you finally hit bottom?" Christopher thought about that for a long moment. All of those things, probably. But mostly because I looked in the mirror one day and realized I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. I didn't like him. I didn't respect him. And I didn't want to be him anymore. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Nothing. I just wanted you to know that I'm working on it. That I understand what I did to you, to Mom's memory, to our family. And that I'm sorry. I appreciate that. Dad, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you okay? Living alone, doing things by yourself, not having us around?" I looked across the garden at the tomatoes I'd grown, thought about my painting class and my trip to Ireland and my friendship with Frank. "Yes," I said. "I am happy. Maybe not the way I expected to be, but happy." Christopher nodded. "Good. That's good. I'm glad." He stood up to leave, then turned back. "Would it be okay if I checked in with you sometimes? Not to ask for anything, just to, stay in touch?" "If you want to." "I do." After he left, I sat in the garden until it was full dark. The crickets were singing and the air smelled like tomato plants and evening dew. I thought about forgiveness, about second chances, about the difference between rebuilding a relationship and starting a new one. I wasn't ready to trust Christopher again. Maybe I never would be. But I was willing to see what kind of person he might become if he kept working at it. And if he didn't? Well, I'd learned that I could be okay either way. Christmas came again, as it always does. Exactly 1 year after the dinner that changed everything. Exactly 1 year after I sat at my empty table realizing I'd been abandoned by the person I loved most. But this year was different. This year, I wasn't cooking for people who might not show up. I wasn't hoping for phone calls that might not come. I wasn't setting myself up for disappointment by expecting love from people who had other priorities. This year, I was hosting Christmas dinner for people who actually wanted to be there. Frank arrived first, carrying a bottle of wine and a homemade apple pie. "I haven't baked since Martha died," he said, setting the pie on the kitchen counter. But I figured it was time to try again. Dorothy came next, wearing a red dress that looked like something from a 1950s magazine and carrying a casserole dish full of her famous green bean almondine. "I brought extra," she said, "in case your son shows up." Jessica from the painting class brought her 2 kids, Tyler, who was 7, and Emma, who was 9. They immediately gravitated toward the tree and started examining the ornaments with the kind of intense curiosity that only children possess. "Is this you?" Emma asked, holding up the framed photo of Margaret and me from our 25th anniversary. "That's my wife," I said. "Her name was Margaret. She died last year." "She was pretty," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Is she in heaven?" "I think so. My hamster died last month. Mom says he's in heaven too, but I think it's probably different sections. Like one section for people and one section for pets." I laughed. "That makes sense to me." The afternoon was loud and chaotic in the best possible way. Tyler spilled cranberry sauce on his shirt. Emma got into an argument with Dorothy about whether Santa Claus was real. Frank told stories about his engineering days that made everyone laugh. Jessica helped me in the kitchen and complimented my cooking in a way that felt genuine rather than polite. At one point, I stepped outside onto the front porch for a moment of quiet. The air was cold but not bitter, and the sky was that particular shade of gray that often comes with Christmas weather in the South. I could hear laughter and conversation spilling out through the windows behind me. That's when I saw Christopher's car turning into my driveway. He got out slowly, carrying a wrapped present and wearing the kind of nervous expression people get when they're not sure they're welcome. Samantha was with him, which surprised me. She'd never voluntarily come to my house before. "Dad," Christopher said as he approached the porch, "I hope it's okay that we stopped by. I wanted to give you this." He held up the present. "It's fine," I said. "But I should warn you. I have company." "Oh?" He looked disappointed. "We can come back another time." "No, come in. Meet my friends." I introduced Christopher and Samantha to everyone. Frank shook Christopher's hand with the kind of firm grip that conveys both welcome and warning. Dorothy was gracious but observant, the way librarians always are. Jessica simply smiled and went back to helping Emma untangle a strand of Christmas lights. Christopher handed me the present. Inside was a check for $41,000 and a handwritten letter. "You don't have to read it now," he said, "but I wanted you to have it today." I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. "Thank you." "Are you staying for dinner?" Dorothy asked. "There's plenty of food." Christopher looked at me. "We don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding," I said, "but you're also not the guests of honor. This dinner is for people who show up when they say they will." It was a gentle reproach, but Christopher understood it. "We deserved that." "Yes, you did, but you're here now and it's Christmas, so sit down and eat something." The conversation over dinner was different with Christopher and Samantha there. More careful, less spontaneous, but not uncomfortable. Tyler asked Christopher about his job, and Christopher spent 10 minutes explaining construction in terms a 7-year-old could understand. Samantha complimented the sweet potato casserole and asked for the recipe. Small gestures, but genuine ones. After dinner, while the others were in the living room, Christopher helped me clear the table. "This is nice," he said, stacking plates. "Your friends seem really good." "They are. They show up when they say they will, they mean what they say, and they don't expect anything from me except friendship." Christopher nodded. I read Mom's letter, the one she left in the safety deposit box. I stopped loading the dishwasher, and she was right about everything. About the gambling, about me using you, about me not being the son you deserved. What else did she say? That she hoped I'd figure out how to be better before it was too late, and that she loved me anyway, even though she was disappointed in who I'd become. I could hear Margaret's voice in those words, honest but not cruel, disappointed but not dismissive. "Are you?" I asked. "Better, I mean." "I'm working on it," Every day. Some days are harder than others. That's all anyone can do. We finished cleaning up in comfortable silence. When we rejoined the group in the living room, Emma was reading The Night Before Christmas to Tyler, who was curled up on the couch with his eyes half closed. Christopher and Samantha left before dessert, but not in a hurry. They said proper goodbyes, thanked everyone for including them, and promised to call soon. Whether they would or not remained to be seen, but the promise felt different this time. More realistic. Less desperate. After everyone else had gone home, I sat in my living room with a cup of coffee and Christopher's letter. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not empty, but peaceful. Not lonely, but restful. The letter was 3 pages long, written in Christopher's careful handwriting. He apologized for specific things, the forged checks, the lies, the years of taking me for granted. He explained his addiction without using it as an excuse. He outlined his plan for staying sober and rebuilding his life. But the part that meant the most was near the end. I know I can't undo what I did. And I know I can't go back to being the son you thought you had. But I want to try to become the son you deserve. Even if it takes the rest of my life. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do. I'm proud of you for building a new life without me. I'm proud of you for not waiting around for me to figure out how to be better. And I'm grateful that you let me come to dinner today, even though I hadn't earned the right to be there. Love. Christopher. I folded the letter and put it on the mantel next to Margaret's photo. Then I walked through the house, turning off lights and checking locks, doing the small rituals that marked the end of a day. In the kitchen, I looked out the window at the backyard. The garden was dormant now, just dark soil and the skeletal remains of tomato plants. But underneath, the roots were still alive, waiting for spring. That's when I realized something important. I hadn't just survived the year. I'd grown. Not in spite of being abandoned, but because of it. Being forced to rebuild my life from scratch had taught me things about myself I never would have learned otherwise. I was stronger than I'd thought. I was more interesting than I'd believed. I was capable of creating love and meaning and joy without waiting for someone else to provide it. And maybe most importantly, I'd learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. They're not the same thing at all. It's been 2 years now since that first Christmas alone. 2 years since I learned what my son had been doing, what my wife had been hiding, what I was capable of when I stopped waiting for other people to define my worth. Christopher and I talk once a month, sometimes more. He's been sober for 18 months. He and Samantha are in a better place, though she still looks at me sometimes like she's not sure what to make of the man who used to let her husband walk all over him. The financial restitution was important, but not for the money. It was important because it represented Christopher taking responsibility for his actions. He didn't have to pay me back. Legally, the statute of limitations had probably run out, and I wasn't going to pursue it. But he did it anyway, because it was part of becoming the person he wanted to be. I sold the house in Macon last spring. Not because I was running from memories, but because I'd outgrown it. I bought a smaller place near the mountains, closer to the community college where I still take art classes. It has a bigger garden space and a front porch that faces west, perfect for watching sunsets. Frank moved up here too, into a cottage about a mile away. We're not roommates or anything dramatic like that, but we're neighbors. We have coffee most mornings and work in our respective gardens most afternoons. Sometimes we cook dinner together. Sometimes we sit on one of our porches and don't talk at all. It's not the life I planned when I was 30 or 50 or even 70. But it's a good life. A life built on choice rather than obligation, on presence rather than guilt, on hope rather than expectation. Last Christmas I hosted dinner again. Frank, Dorothy, Jessica, and her kids, a few other friends I'd made through various activities and interests. Christopher and Samantha came too, bearing gifts and stories and the kind of relaxed energy that comes from knowing you're welcome but not required. We ate too much food, told too many stories, and laughed until our sides hurt. Tyler fell asleep on the couch during dessert. Emma taught everyone a card game her teacher had shown her. Dorothy and Frank got into a good-natured argument about politics that lasted through 3 cups of coffee. It was loud and messy and imperfect and absolutely wonderful. As I was cleaning up that night, I found myself thinking about Margaret. Not with sadness, but with gratitude. She'd protected me from the truth about Christopher for as long as she could, but she'd also made sure I'd have the tools to handle that truth when the time came. The money she'd hidden away, the house she'd titled in my name, the letters she'd left behind. They weren't just practical provisions. They were love letters. Reminders that I was worth protecting, worth investing in, worth believing in. And maybe that's the real lesson I learned during those dark months after she died. Love isn't just about being chosen by other people. It's about choosing yourself. It's about deciding that your life has value regardless of who else recognizes it. It's about building something beautiful and meaningful and true, even if you have to build it alone. Especially if you have to build it alone. Because when you learn to love yourself enough to demand better treatment, when you learn to create your own joy instead of waiting for someone else to provide it, when you learn to choose presence over hope and reality over fantasy, that's when you discover who you really are. And who you really are might be pretty amazing. If you've ever felt forgotten by the people who were supposed to love you most, I see you. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from scratch because the people you counted on walked away, I understand. And if you've ever discovered that being alone isn't the same thing as being lonely, you know what I'm talking about. This story isn't just about one man's Christmas. It's about learning to choose yourself when everyone else chooses someone else. It's about discovering that family isn't just blood, and love isn't just history, and happiness isn't just luck. It's about becoming the person you were always meant to be, even if it takes losing everything to find them. Hit that subscribe button if this story meant something to you. Not for me, but for everyone who's sitting at an empty table wondering if they matter. And if you don't feel moved to subscribe, scroll down and tell me why in the comments. I want to understand your perspective too. Because everyone's story matters. Everyone's voice deserves to be heard. And everyone, no matter how forgotten they feel, deserves to be chosen. Even if they have to choose themselves first.